guys, Misty here. I wanted to tell you really quick that the Masterpiece Society studio is on sale now. Listen, Alicia only opens up membership to the Masterpiece Society studio twice a year. So it is on sale right now, January 20th through the end of the week, January 24th. And after that, you will not be able to get into this membership program until August. So stop what you're doing right now and head to findingjoyinthejrney.net/Masterpiece Society to check out this amazing art program. Now, let's get on with the podcast.
Welcome to the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast
with our mom,
Misty Bailey. Tips and encouragement
for
real-life homeschooling
is headed your way.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast. I am Misty Bailey, blogger at Joy in the Journey and podcaster here at Joyfully Homeschooling. And today's episode is with Sarita Holzmann from Sunlight. And I first talked with Sarita back in episode 53, and I am so excited to have her back on the podcast. In episode 53, she and I got on the topic, we were supposed to talk about literature-based education, and we ended up talking some about missions, and I said I'd have to have her back on the podcast because missions is a near and dear topic in the Bailey house, as my oldest has felt led into the mission field. And so we're praying about which way she's going to go. She's still young. She's only 15, but we've definitely tried to do a better job of raising globally minded kids here in our home. You know, we talk about different countries. I've been reading different missionary stories, and I recently read The Mission-Minded Child from Anne Dunnigan, and it really opened my eyes to the need for world missions. So I wanted to have Sarita back on the podcast, and we talk about so many things. We talk about missions and mission work, the importance of grand worldview, what courses you may be able to have your child take, and what resources you may use in your home to prepare your child if they are feeling led into the mission field. We talk about what you as a parent can do if your child comes to you and says they feel led into the mission field. We talk about those feelings that you may feel and what you can then do to prepare them and prepare yourself for that possibility. We talk about the benefits of literature-based education in regards to raising globally minded kids. And this is just a really, really wonderful and thorough episode full of practical tips and encouragement that you can go and use in your home today to help raise more globally minded kids. So I'm super excited about this interview, and I just know it will bless you and help you have a more joyful homeschool. So without further ado, here is my episode with Sarita Holzmann. Podcast sponsors make the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast possible. So let's take a moment and thank our current sponsor, Masterpiece Society. Don't just expose your kids to art, let them experience it. Charlotte Mason wrote, "The art training of children should proceed on two lines. The child should begin both to express himself creatively and learn to appreciate art. Masterpiece Society is here to help you with both art expression and art appreciation. By utilizing our rich multimedia art lessons and our Open and Go art appreciation curriculum, you will create meaningful art experiences with your kids and teens. We have completed a few lessons from the Masterpiece Society over the last few weeks and have really enjoyed what we have completed so far. They make bringing art, beauty, and creativity into our home a painless process, which is perfect for this busy homeschool mom who cringes at the thought of arts and crafts. Don't believe me? Try it out yourself for free. Go to findingjoyinthejrney.net/Masterpiece Society to get your free lesson delivered straight to your inbox. That is findingjoyinthejrney.net/Masterpiece Society to get your free lesson delivered straight to your inbox. Now, let's get on with the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I am super excited today to talk again with Sarita from Sunlight. We introduced her back in episode 53, and it is an honor to have her back on the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about raising global-minded kids with a heart for the world. And particularly, I want to talk about missions and how we can raise mission-minded kids. So before we get started, Sarita, can you introduce yourself real quick and share why you started Sunlight? Because I know your why for Sunlight is how we got the idea for this episode topic.
And that absolutely is true. Thank you for having me back. And my husband and I were missionaries at the U.S. Center for World Mission back in the early days when Dr. Winter was really introducing to the world the whole idea of the unreached peoples. Believe it or not, that was an unidentified topic. And it was one of those things that actually changed how missions was done through the generations. It's just amazing that we happen to be a part of that. We lived at the U.S. Center, the little housing that surrounded the U.S. Center was a former campus, a college campus that they purchased. And then they bought the little bungalows that went around the campus where the professors originally had lived. So we all lived right within walking distance of the campus, which was amazing. You had a chance to rub shoulders every day with all the people you worked with, people who were like-minded, and it was a huge, huge privilege. But we all had the exact same dilemma in that our particular square mile that we were in the middle of was all the students were bused to a very substandard school, and we all didn't quite know what to do with our children. So we ended up putting our oldest daughter in a little Christian school that was nearby, and the other kids were too young. But then when Luke got old enough, we changed agencies and our support dropped, and we actually couldn't afford to send him to Christian school as well. So my husband came home and he said, I wonder if you should homeschool our kids. Oh my goodness, I can't do that. Don't put me in that box. They figured out how to do that. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. But because of our finances, I ended up doing that. And I actually really, really loved it. I found I had an affinity for it. I loved the fact that I got to spend time with my kids and get to know them, in a real unique way. And I had a backyard neighbor who we had very similar educational models, and we shared ideas. And she came to me and she said, Sarita, if you think it's hard to homeschool here in the States, it's 50 times harder overseas, because you can get a catalog, you can look at it, and you could say, well, I think I'll give this a whirl. That sounds better than sliced bread. And you'll order it, and it takes maybe 6 months to get there. And then it comes and it's not even the right thing. She said, so what we need to do is pick the best of the best, put it in a box and send it to friends of mine overseas so that they can stay on the mission field. She said, because the number one reason people came home from the field was they couldn't get along with their peers. And I couldn't do anything about that. But the number two reason people came home from the field was they couldn't figure out how to educate their kids, particularly when you're talking about the unreached peoples. Right before the unreached peoples movement kind of started, people kept going back to the same mission compounds. And, they had schools and they had hospitals and they had clinics. They had everything you needed in this compound because they had been there established. But the minute you go to a country where there's nobody to meet you at the airport, you do not know what to do with your kids' education. I thought, I'm a pretty organized person. Let me pull together all these pieces, because if I could keep someone on the field for one more year by making education easy, wouldn't that be the greatest thing ever? And I thought, well, let me do that in the afternoons while my kids napped. And that's honestly how Sunlight started. And in the early days, we didn't, of course, do any advertising. We actually charged for our catalog. We said, send us $2 and we'll take $2 off your first order.
Oh.
But it was amazing because you'd have friends telling friends, because it was just so novel and it was so different. But it was one of those where you'd have a sale in Kansas City and then you'd have 10, just like that.
Oh.
It was very fun.
I love it, but there probably wasn't a lot on the market at that point either.
Right. There was nothing else like it on the market. I mean, at the time you could buy Bob Jones and you could buy a Becca. And I think there were probably a few others, but nothing literature-based, right? And if you're looking for painless learning, boy, there's nothing easier than literature-based, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
one of those where moms kind of went, oh my goodness, this is the most fun we've had ever teaching. So that's really why it spread. So
Yeah. So through the years, what has been your experience with missions and mission work?
Well, my husband and I, when we were at the U.S. Center, we were considered missionaries at the time. John was the main one, but I was a missionary on home support, I think they called it at the time. And while we were at the center, they did a lot of training and praying for, and the unreached peoples was really proclaimed. And my husband worked for Mission Frontiers, which was their newspaper at the time. Beyond that, I've had the huge privilege of being able to serve on the Frontiers Board. Frontiers, of course, is an agency that sends people only to the Muslim world. It's coming up probably on its 35th year. And when they started, the founder, Greg Livingstone, was told, "You can't send people to the Muslim world. They can't be saved." And he went, "Now, wait just a minute. Doesn't it say that there will be some from every tribe, nation, tongue, and people?" He's going, "Yeah, I bet they can." But isn't that an amazing story? If you think about how many countries have turned. I mean, it's one of those where God is on the move in the Muslim world. So that's my main experience. As a board member, I have a chance to meet some of the frontier people on the field, and it's an enormous privilege.
Yeah, we actually have some friends through our church who have went overseas, and their desire, their heart is heavy for the Muslim community. And they actually went in a pretty dangerous area. They never actually told us where they went, but it was around Georgia in the Middle East, and served there. And their goal at some point is to go back over there and stay and start churches. So yeah, they've said the same thing. God is really moving within the Muslim community. So
there's some villages where they have changed the mosque to a church. I mean, there are places where there are absolute people movements happening. We don't hear about it because that's not dramatic enough for the news, but God is on the move in the Muslim world. It's very, very exciting what he's doing.
Yeah. So I had some quotes here that I pulled from the Mission-Minded Child or Mission-Minded Family. I can't remember there's two books, but I pulled some out of this, and it says that only 0.3%, there's a huge missions need. Only 0.3% of money poured into missions is spent on reaching those who have never once heard God's good news. And 1.6 billion people in the world are still waiting for their first opportunity to hear the gospel. And when you put that in perspective, that's mind-blowing to me, but we don't talk about it. I don't feel like we really talk about it. So why do you think teaching our kids these statistics and teaching a grand worldview, and that there's more to the world than just here in the United States, why do you think that's so important?
Oh, it's so important because the peoples of the world, of course, are what are on God's heart. And if we want to do things that are aligned to what the Father wants, we need to focus on the things that he has. Again, that passage from Revelation, that there's going to be some from every tribe, nation, tongue, people. If we want to see that happen, and that was Dr. Winter's breakthrough. He was teaching at Fuller Seminary, and he'd have missionaries that would come back through, and he'd ask them where they'd served. And he had this day where he went, I could be here 1,000 years and never meet a missionary to Afghanistan or Pakistan. So then he went back to that verse and he went, now, wait a minute, if God's going to return when all the peoples have heard, which is what he says, can we work toward that goal, which is his passion and his heart? So that's when we started the center. But if we want to have kids that are in alignment with what God desires and what God wants, and I think there's other reasons too, if we want to read the news effectively, I mean, if you don't know where Somalia is and, the Black Hawk Down happens or whatever might happen in the news, we want our kids to be aware of that, to be able to pray with great passion and understanding of the peoples of the world. We want kids to be big, globally minded, right? We live in an interconnected world. So to raise up kids that say, I understand what's happening around the world, and I want to enter in as much as I can. I think that's a worthy and a good goal to have.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So what are some ways that we as parents can raise mission-minded kids and can raise kids who have a heart for the world in general, not just those here in our community?
Well, one of the ways that we've chosen to do that in Sunlight is we have kids read a lot of missionary biographies.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love missionary biographies because they're just really, really ordinary people who are faithful and go and do amazing things for God. I think, can we give our kids better heroes than people who are willing to go and share the hope that's within them with people who've never had a chance to hear? I just love them. They're great, and I think they're really good for our kids as well. Another thing that we as a family did while our kids were younger were whenever we'd have a missionary in town, we'd have them in for something simple like waffles or whatever it might be, and they got to hear the stories of things that were happening on the field and in their arena. Gives kids again a chance to see that it's normal, it's not odd, it's regular people who go, people who think like we do, they're dressed like we do, but they just have a really cool job. So we get a chance to share that with them. I think if you can take a missions trip, I think that's always good for kids to see the world in a new and a fresh way, and to recognize and see what God needs to do in the world to transform it. One of the things we do at Sunlight every morning, we pray for an unreached people. Uh, it's not, none of our employees, of course, come from that kind of a mindset, but we read a little story about them. We use the Global Prayer Digest, and we just pray every morning for a people group that still needs to come and hear. Well, your statistic was striking. 1.6 million people still need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
If we need to somehow help our kids get that vision and that view. And I think too, we can read stories that take place in other parts of the world, stories that demonstrate, that although people maybe eat different food and they maybe dress different clothing, or maybe they even look different, they still want the same things we all do, right? We all want our kids to have enough food and get the education they need and have a good life. I mean, I just feel like when we read stories, we break down some of those barriers of fear and some of that trepidation that we might have just as people living, so isolated from the rest of the world. In a perfect world, we could probably even have foreign students into our home. Or I just think there's ways we can break down some of those barriers and some of those walls.
Well, I think that through books, we also make the characters, the real people, we make it more relatable.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we've read a lot of the YWAM books, and some of our favorites have been George Muller and Corrie ten Boom. And I know Corrie ten Boom wasn't a missionary, but those have been some of our favorites. But the tones of the books, when you read good literature, you feel like you're there. You feel like you're walking amongst those characters, and you want to learn more. I think you just naturally want to learn more about that time period, about the people that you're reading about. And it just is such a natural way of learning, I feel. And they have really opened our minds and our hearts to the world that's out there, and has really softened my kids' hearts to the understanding that there are people out there who need to hear the gospel.
I totally agree. And George Mueller is one of my favorites too. Boy, that story when the kids have no food for breakfast and the cart breaks down.
Yes. Yes. And it's like, you can't make that stuff up. I mean, if that's not a God story, I don't know what is.
That's totally true.
Yeah. So, Sarita, what would you say to a parent whose child has told them they feel led into the mission field? As I've talked on this podcast before, and I've talked to you, my daughter, Allison, told us this last summer at the end of her summer camp, that she felt God calling her on the mission field. And I went through a whole array of emotions, from fear to fear of the unknown, like fear of, okay, if God's calling her overseas, future grandchildren and danger and all of these things, as well as a little bit of pride. But if I'm honest, I've prayed a few times through the year for God to change her mind, or maybe that's not his calling. And I know that's not right, but that desire is kind of what got us into reading more mission stories and everything. But what would you say to a parent whose child has told them that they feel led into the mission field.
Yeah. I think every parent that hears that from their kids has that whole range of emotions as well. And the emotions are real. But I guess I would say that near isn't necessarily better. And I can base that on the fact that my sister and her children lived a mile from my mom. And we lived all the way across the country. We lived in California and she was in Michigan. And every summer I would put my four kids on a plane and we'd fly there. We'd spend 3 weeks with my mom. And at the end of it all, my sister said, I think your kids are closer to grandma and grandpa than my kids ever were.
Aww.
So it's not the nearness, it's the purposefulness, okay?
Yeah.
And I think with today, we can cover a lot of that purposefulness by going and visiting wherever they are in the world. And I think by living with them in their situation, wherever they are, you have a chance to connect with those kids and get closer to them and relate to them in a way that's more meaningful than if they lived just down the road. And I think to stay purposeful, to say, I'm going to call, I'm going to FaceTime, I'm going to write. I can remember one gal who was saying, my aunt wrote to me every week and I still own all those letters. That can be more meaningful for kids on the field than anything else that you could do. And I think too, I probably should have started with this one, but to pray. I think anybody who goes to the field absolutely has to have prayer. They're going to places where darkness has reigned for millennium. And if we don't cover them and pray for them, they're lost. And if you can find a group that can pray, even better. Get a group of women that are committed to pray for this family that's on the field. And I think too, ultimately, I'd say don't fear, because our days are numbered. God knows the time that we have, and his plan, we're not going to change it. If we say, I'm not going to go to the field because I want to stay safe, well, then we get hit by a jaguar instead of getting killed by a jaguar, right? So it's one of those where our days are numbered and we trust that God has the best. And we also rest in that promise, that he'll give us hundredfold, right? If we do things for his great namesake. I mean, it's a huge, huge privilege to get, jewels in your crown. So hopefully that's encouraging of some sort, but it's one of those where I just think, let's not fear, because God knows the plans. And I can remember reading Don Richardson, and they went into a group of headhunters, and he took his wife and his children out of this canoe and stepped among all these people, that 8 people that they killed because they wanted to get, anyway, it was super dangerous. But the minute he took his wife and children out of that boat, all of the warriors, stopped being afraid. They stopped being antagonistic, because all of a sudden it was a family that had stepped in mists, right? So it's one of those that God doesn't just call individuals, he calls families, and it's for the entire good of the family. And here's one more data point. Back in the day when they used to do a who's who book, I don't think they even still do that anymore, but back in the day, the majority of people that made it into who's who came from missionary families, because those families raised up kids that were willing to go to unusual places, learned a second language, could do all the things, but had time to read. I mean, you just think, God is bigger than we'll ever be. So it's one of those where fear not, but rejoice that you have the privilege of sharing your precious family with the world.
Well, I think too, whenever Allison came and told us that she was feeling led into the mission field, the first person I called was my homeschool mentor, Jamie Brown, because her son is the one I had mentioned before, whose family has felt led into the Middle East. And I called her and she's like, I knew years ago, she said that God had a plan for your daughter. And she said, she told me, and I'll never forget it. She said, whatever fear that you're feeling right now, she's like, you should be that much more afraid if your fear pulls her out of God's will. And out of line of what God wants to do in her life, because you're hindering the spirit. And she's like, if God's called her, God will care for her. God will take care of her. She said, and you do not want her out of line with God's will. And that really broke me, because as a parent, you don't want that. You want your kids to follow the path that God has in mind for them. And I don't want to be responsible. I don't want to have to answer someday for taking that away, for not letting her do that or talking her out of that. I don't want to be responsible for that either. And I think fear really stops a lot of parents and a lot of people who maybe are feeling led into the mission field.
Right, right. And I think fear is a true and valid emotion, but I think we can bring that to the Lord too, who's more than willing, to take that away. So I don't think you ever want to deny your feelings, but to take those to the Lord and offer them as a sacrifice before him, and he honors those, right? So fret not, it's all good.
Yeah. Why do you think it's important for our kids to have an understanding of world history and world cultures, particularly in the case of 2 of my 3 kids, at least for now? They have no desire whatsoever to leave the United States.
Yeah.
So why would we want to, encourage the study of world history and world cultures?
Well, I'm pretty committed to world history because I think it helps, and we do it every few years at Sunlight, because we believe that it gives kids an understanding of how the world works, the conflicts that are come up, and to understand what's happening in the world while looking at things from a bigger picture. And I think for your children who don't necessarily want to travel, you can learn a lot about the world just through reading books. If you read stories that take place in other parts, it can ultimately maybe lead them to an openness to go visit other places. But more than that, just raises awareness of what the world is like and how things, you can travel for free. It's perfect by just reading a great story.
Yeah. So how can books help expand a child's horizons and help them grow a big world perspective?
Well, it helps us to see other cultures, because the cultures of the world are different. And if we think everybody's just like us, that's probably not healthy either. So it's a chance for us to recognize the differences in the peoples. We can gain understanding of how the world works. We can, as we read, we can actually learn about things like the different belief systems that are out there. We maybe think everybody thinks like we do, but people who live under communist systems, it's a very different world. And you can read about it and understand it in a way, maybe even more than if you just read it as an encyclopedic type of an article. I can remember reading a story that takes place in Russia. I can't think of the title of it right now, but it's about a boy, and he talks about, I got a carrot today. I bet nobody in the West ever gets a carrot.
Oh,
But it's one
wow.
of those, you just think, well, socialism isn't as glorious as they might, basically his life is pretty terrible. But he's been told, of course, that everybody in the West has it terrible, right? So it's a good chance to see the differences in how people live and how they look at the world, and kind of broadens the mind and helps us to understand even the things that are happening in our world. Very, very important for our kids.
Oh, yeah, totally. So what are the benefits of a literature-based education in raising global-minded kids?
Well, the literature-based education I mentioned earlier that it's one of those very, very easy ways to learn, because everybody loves a story, right? Everybody listens gladly, and it ties to kids' natural curiosity. And even Jesus used stories when he taught, right? Because they grip the mind, they grip the imagination, they're memorable, right? They're always so memorable. And they give us a chance to get information in a way that's very easy. And again, it's easy to remember the things that you've learned. You get practical information, you get exposure to different cultures. There's just literature. It's really the easiest way to teach.
I think one thing too that I love about using books is it's very cost effective. So, especially if somebody is overseas, you can get ebooks very easily without having to wait for them to be shipped. to you, we could take advantage here with our libraries. We have got so many books from our libraries. And then those books that we loved, the ones that were like, okay, we are absolutely going to pass these down to our kids and our,
Mm.
grandkids. You can buy those later. We keep a list in our, in my purse or on my phone of books that we really loved, and then, try to find them at yard sales for a little bit cheaper, or go ahead with Amazon Prime. You can have a book sent to you the next day. But, I love how cost effective literature-based programs are too. So I wanted to mention that you can get a great literature guide, or get a sunlight guide, and use that. But too, it's an easy way to save money and add great resources into your homeschool as well. So that's one
I
thing I've
think
always
too,
loved about it.
yeah, I think literature too helps with that parent-child interaction.
Mm-hmm.
You have a child off doing screen learning or textbook learning. It's not as easy to have a conversation. But when you read a great story, you can talk through the key principles or the things you gleaned, or because you've shared those experiences, right? You have a chance to, and honestly, we have all these memories of the stories we've read together, and uh, we can talk about our favorite books, whereas probably no one ever said this was my favorite textbooks.
Right. Yes, that's so true. And I love now, there's a big age gap with my kids. Like my oldest is 15 and my middle is almost 13. She'll be 13 by the time this airs. And my youngest just turned 8. And so we're now going through some books with him that the girls read when they were younger, and they love reading to him. And it
Mhm.
takes away from me sometimes. Like right now, Daniel and I just started reading Justin Morgan Had a Horse. And Kristen, my middle, is a huge horse lover. And so she's like, well, I want to read it to him. And so we've been fighting over who's going to read this book with Daniel. And I'm like, Kristen, I'm supposed to be reading it to him. But she said, but that was my favorite book. And so we're taking turns. And so like I'm reading a chapter in the morning with him while she's doing her school. And then she's reading a chapter at night. So we're getting left out a little bit back and forth. But I love that because that's a memory that she has of us reading it together, me and her sister. And then now she's wanting to take and read that with him. And we went through the same thing with Benjamin West. We had a similar dilemma there. So I love that. I love those memories that you can
Yeah.
build with all of your kids.
Yeah, I think too, I used it as kind of a carrot. You get your math and your spelling and stuff done, and then we're going to read. It was one of those where, who doesn't love a story, right? So the kids would, play with Legos, and boy, we'd read for hours, and we just thought that was just the greatest thing. We still have those very precious memories of those times of reading together, and it's all really, really good.
Yeah, and nobody can take those from you. Like those memories that you build with your kids around a good book. That's something nobody can take from you. And I love it. So, Sarita, the last question I have is, what does literature add to the study of the world?
Well, of course, as we read stories that take place in other parts of the world, we get to see people living in their varied cultures. We get to see the communities. They help us to see the differences and the similarities, right? We can see how a Buddhist person would do things very different than somebody that does in our land. But the family is always going to be the piece that we resonate with, because kids are kids and they love dogs and they love to play, and so we can see the world through a different lens, but recognize that people are the same all over the world. Helps us to understand our similarities and our differences, even if we don't believe the same things or we don't eat the same things. It helps us to have a better understanding of the world that we've been in. So I think it's important for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that seeing that and seeing that, what we're doing here, having dinner, raising our kids, going to the grocery store, school, all of that, it's the same, but it's different, across the
Right.
globe.
And I,
our families are doing the same
mm,
things here that, families are doing overseas. We sponsor a little boy, Joseph, from Uganda through Compassion. And we went through this Compassion House. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but they take these trailers and they take them to churches. It's called the Compassion Experience. Have you ever heard of that?
uh-uh.
Yeah, so they take these trailers and they take them to different churches across the country, and you walk through these trailers, and each trailer represents a child living in a different country, and they talk about what their life's like there, what their family life is like, what their school is like, what their jobs are, and it's heartbreaking in one extent because you're seeing how different these kids live and how life really is for them. But the other part of it, it's relatable because these kids, they have parents, they have chores, they want to go to school, they have this desire to go to school and get an education, um but it just really raises your awareness, I think. And we actually we did the Compassion Experience after we had read George Muller, and talked about, and some of the other mission stories, and talked about some of the different countries. We then did the Compassion Experience to see what these kids live like. And so that really opened up our eyes, and then allowed us to learn more. But it was crazy to me and to my
Yes.
kids, and just eye-opening, an eye-opening experience.
And I think it sounds like it was a wonderful experience. So thank you for doing that. That's a very, very meaningful thing for your kids to do. And I think your kids will only benefit from that because we live in such a globally
Mm-hmm.
connected world. Our future employers will be grateful if we can work easily with our Indian coworkers or our coworkers who come from some nation in Africa. If we have the understanding and the ability to recognize those kinds of things, that'll just be helping our children achieve and accomplish in this world even better.
Yeah. So, okay. So, Sarita, I think that's it. I think that's all we have. Was there anything else you wanted to add on this topic?
No, I guess I also want to close with saying I'm just grateful that you're building a sense of compassion in your children as opposed to entitlement. We often get into that mindset that the world owes me everything.
Mm-hmm.
And as we look at the world and see the needs and the need of particularly of Christ for the world, to raise up kids with that sense of compassion for the lost, super, super important. So carry on, keep up the good work. And if we can figure out how to help our kids grow in the understanding of the world and the needs of the world, and uh, and raise up compassion, boy, that's only good that we can do for our kids.
Yes, that's so true. I thought of one more question, and you don't know
Oh,
about this one, and I'm gonna throw it at you.
okay.
And that is, Sarita, what has been your favorite missionary story?
Hmm. It's probably Gladys Aylward.
See, we've not read that one yet. I have it, and we've not read it.
Okay. I think because she's so ordinary. She's
Mm-hmm.
so ordinary. She's a parlor maid. She doesn't even have a good education. And she gets on this train and crosses across Russia on a train, if you can believe that, going from England all the way to China. Ends up somehow in Japan. She takes a boat, I think, to get there. And she ultimately ends up in China, and then basically helps run an inn. And then they would drag in these mule train drivers that were bringing goods, and they tell them Bible stories.
Oh,
And then she ends up with all these orphans that need a place to stay. And then I think World War II begins, and she has to bring them to safety. But God covering and taking care of them, quite a story.
I
Please
love
enjoy
it.
that one. Next, yeah.
Yeah, we will. Mine's, as I've already said, is George Muller, but Allison's is Amy Carmichael, without a doubt.
Sure, she's quite a gal too.
Yeah.
One of those where I think too, you could also do Adoniram Judson. Wow, going off to Burma, quite a story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've read that one too.
Yeah.
Well, Sarita, thank you so much. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and connect with you on the web?
It's at sunlight.com. That it's SONLIGHT. Please get a catalog. It's got a list of a lot of our favorite resources for this type of a topic. Please just connect with we have a Facebook group that talks about sunlight types things, and ask any questions you might have. That's a strong community, and they'd be glad to welcome anyone who wants to come in. That's probably all I know, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarita, so much. It has been a blessing talking to you again.
And thank you for having me. And may you have strength for all the things that you do. And thank you for encouraging homeschoolers in the important and worthy task they have.
Thank you. Have a blessed day, my friend.
Thank you. You too. Blessings on you. Bye-bye.
This has been an episode of the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast. I thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take the time to leave a rating or review on iTunes or whatever platform it is that you use to listen to this podcast. That tells the powers to be I'm not talking to myself. Also, hit subscribe. Then you will catch every episode of the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast each week right there in your podcast feed. You can find show notes and more at joyfullyhomeschooling.com and clicking on the episode number of the episode you are looking for. Thanks, guys. I hope this podcast encouraged you to head out there and have a more joyful homeschool.